Right, so today I'm going to talk about smelling. How do you smell something? And this actually is something that's quite important. So you can imagine if you're trying to do perfumery, so you're trying to make something smell nice, it might actually be quite useful to know how to smell something properly. And this, I would say, is definitely a fundamental skill of a perfumer. I mean, it's got to be something that's second nature, but you want to know how to do it properly. And the reason that I say this is because a lot of people don't smell properly. I mean, smelling something in real life is fine, you just smell it. But when you're trying to do perfumery, you have to smell things in a certain way. So one mistake that I see a lot of people make is they'll take kind of a bottle and they'll just open it and they'll smell it, right? And there are so many things that are wrong with this. There are so many things. So, right, firstly, when you've got a bottle like this, it's completely unrepresentative of the strength of a real perfume. So you've got to understand that when you're making a perfume, any one ingredient is probably going to be 1% or less in most cases, maybe a bit more. But what that means is you definitely want to have the material diluted beforehand. So here, for example, I've got something, so this is floralizone, which is a synthetic molecule, and that's actually diluted to 1%. And what this means is that if I were to go and smell this, you've got a much more accurate picture of what it actually might be like in a perfume. So that is the first thing, which is good. And the second thing is, when you're smelling like this, you're susceptible to something called olfactory fatigue. Yeah, so olfactory fatigue, it's basically a phenomenon that occurs, which is that when you smell something, all the molecules, so they go into your nose and they go into the receptors, and obviously that's why you smell it. But when these molecules go to your receptors, they aren't evacuated straight away, right? They kind of stick around a little bit. So what happens is that over time, all of the receptors get blocked, and you become effectively desensitized to a smell. So when you keep smelling something, what's going to happen is your perception of the smell is actually going to get less and less and less over time until you smell nothing. So this is actually the same effect as like when you go into the kitchen, say you're making some food, and the first 5 minutes you're chopping up all like the vegetables and the rosemary, the garlic, all that kind of stuff, and it smells quite nice. You're like, this is going to be some good food here. But then what happens is you start cooking it, and then you don't smell anything anymore. So you don't think anything of it, but then maybe someone else comes in the room and they say, oh, that smells nice. And of course, at this point, you can't smell anything at all. So that's exactly the same phenomenon happening here. So that's called olfactory fatigue. So this is something you really want to avoid at all costs. So basically, whenever you're trying to smell something, you want to avoid olfactory fatigue. So there are a number of ways we're going to do this, but firstly, not smelling from the bottle, because you're smelling such a high concentration that basically your nose is just going to get blocked up, so it's not a good idea. So yeah, then here comes the question of how do you smell properly. So you want to take one of these scent strips. You can find these like on eBay or somewhere like that. Basically they are filter paper, effectively. They're just kind of absorbent paper. But this is pretty much what you want to use. And you want to take one, and you just want to dip it in. So this is the diluted, the floralizone that I had earlier. Right, so we just take it, dip it in. Now, the temptation is to smell this straight away, but don't. And the reason for that is because it's just been in the bottle, so all the ethanol, which is the solvent, which is really volatile, that is still kind of hanging around on the strip. So for now, basically a load of ethanol is going to go up your nose. So what you want to do is kind of leave it for, I would say, a minute or two, and then you can do your first evaluation. And actually, when you're doing this, you want to label it. It's quite important. So I'm just going to write this. I normally write like the percentage, the molecule you're smelling, and what time. Those three things, I would say, because otherwise you're going to get left with a load of strips and you're going to have no ideas like what's what. And when you want to start doing evaluations for a longer time period, so say it's a base note you're looking at, you want to know what happens preferably over a day or a few days. That's going to be more important than maybe what happens straight away. So at that point, you're going to need to really label the strips. But I mean, okay, so now I've got that, we've got to consider where we're smelling here. So you definitely don't want to smell in the room or somewhere where you prepared your samples, or where your aroma chemicals are kept. And the reason for this is because it's a source of contamination. So firstly, having those molecules lingering in the air can be a source of that olfactory fatigue that I was talking about. But secondly, you can have foreign molecules, so molecules different to what you're trying to be smelling, which go in the air, and that can actually alter your perception of what you're actually trying to smell. So you want to be ideally in a completely odorless environment, so somewhere maybe with some fresh air, like an open window, even outside, that's not too bad, or a room that's completely separate from anything else. Right, secondly, you want to make sure that you're only smelling a few samples at a time. So you don't want to have kind of loads and loads and loads of things at once. You want to, because your nose is going to get tired, what you want to do is have just a few things to evaluate at a time. And then, maybe a few hours later or something, when your nose has had a chance to kind of get back to normal, then you can go back and you can keep going. So I think consistency is a lot better than just trying to go in once, smell everything, because your nose is going to get confused, it's going to get full of molecules, which is going to start blocking up your receptors, and effectively things are going to start going wrong. Thirdly, you can do things like make sure you're really hydrated. This is going to help the mucous membrane inside your nose, so where all these molecules are docking, it's going to help that clear itself out and regenerate. And if you do this, then that's going to definitely help you kind of have that clarity in perception. And other things like if you do regular exercise, that will help with the same thing, clear out the mucous membrane, help you kind of reset your nose. So that stuff's all good. Right, so now it's been kind of 2 minutes or something, so I'm going to take this, which is a floralizone. Right, so you don't want to contaminate your nose, that's the other thing. So when you smell it, you don't want to hold it, you don't want to touch your nose, because if you do that, basically the molecules are going to get onto your nose, and then that's going to cause the olfactory fatigue. And then when you smell it again, suddenly you're already going to be used to it, so you're not going to smell it anymore, or at least smell it a lot less. So I would say keep the tip about 1 centimeter away from your nose if possible. And then the next thing is, when you're about to smell it, you want to take 1 or 2 inhalations, and that's it, because again, it's that same effect with the olfactory fatigue. You don't want to give your nose any chance to get used to it. You want to kind of have this the smell, you want to crystallize it in your mind, and then you want to find the words to describe it and write them down, and that's it. Then you just want to walk away and leave it. So I've just smelled that, and that's fine. Like that's all I need. One smell, and to me that smells very much of water, like a fresh kind of almost metallic water. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to write that down, and that's it. It's just, what does it smell of? And that is kind of step 1 in crystallizing exactly how that thing smells to me. So the idea is that if I now go and repeat that, so firstly I can do this over time, so I can see how that evolves until it doesn't smell anymore, because that's important, right? When you're using a certain material, you want to know it. You want to know it really deeply, because that's how you're going to be able to use it properly in a perfume. You don't want to just chuck it in there, because you're going to have no idea what's going to happen. You want to understand it really, really in depth, exactly how it's going to evaporate in general over time. That's going to give you the best chance of making it actually work in a perfume. Okay, and finally, the last point is contamination. So I talked about how you contaminate your nose, but you've got to notice some other sources potentially that could kind of mess with your perception. So one is if you've just eaten a meal full of foods that smell quite strongly. So say you've had like garlic or something like that. Or say you've brushed your teeth and you've got that mintiness in your mouth. Or maybe you had a coffee. All of that kind of smell, that can actually interfere with what you're selling on the strip. So it's important to bear that in mind and try to avoid it. And the other thing is, when you've got your scent strips, you want to be careful not to put them, so I've got a few here, you don't want to put them like too close together, because if you have a load of them and they're all kind of wet with the ethanol and the chemical, they can actually cross-contaminate through the air slightly. I've noticed this happen before. So if you take 2 different samples and you dip them and then you leave the scent strips next to each other, because the ethanol evaporates, it's got such a high vapor pressure and it pulls all of the perfume material with it. What happens is that ethanol can rise up off one scent strip and then it can kind of hit the next scent strip and deposit the material onto it. So if you've got a material that's quite strong, then that second strip, even though they're not touching, the second one can start to smell of the first, or vice versa. Yeah, so ideally when your strips are wet and you've just dipped them, you want to keep them quite far apart. And then later on, maybe it's after a day or so, depends on what the material is, but once the smell has got very faint and weak, what that means effectively in most cases is the vapor pressure has become very low. So the risk of contamination by leaving the strips next to each other isn't so much. So yeah, after maybe a day or something, all the strips, you can leave them right next to each other. But straight away in the first at least 15 minutes or a few hours, you want to kind of keep them maybe separated by, I would say, like 10 centimeters at least, or something like that. Yeah, anyway, that's all there is to it pretty much. But it is, as I say, it's an important skill. And just a few little things like that, making sure you smell the right way, it can have such a big impact. And it will definitely improve your ability to get a really clear idea of how things smell. And that's really, really important. If you want to do perfumery. Anyway, so that's enough of that. I think next video I might do some more maybe on exactly how I plan, smelling things right, because you've got to take into account things like different concentrations and different times, and how you get to know materials properly, that kind of thing. So I might talk a bit about, like what kind of exercises, what kind of techniques you want to use for really drilling down into a material and getting to know it properly, because that is one of the kind of pillars of perfumery. And like, if you can master that, you will be well on your way to understanding how to make a full perfume. So if you like this video, give it a like, give it a subscribe, give it a comment, whatever.